Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Wonder-working power in the precious...
Incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria.
You may wish to adjust the dial. You are currently tuned into the wrong station. The people lived on water. From the water grew the reeds which they wove into canoes, and packed with mud to make islands in the flood on which they could weave their homes. From the water came the fish and waterfowl and reeds they ate. From the water came the Abgalu, who guided them. They lived like this for 60,000 years, at least. Then came a young man named Alulim, who ranged far on his canoe, even to the mountain's heels, where the purple shadows spilled across the water with the dying day. But the light of sunset was golden on the mountain peaks, and Alulim would sit for a long time watching them, wishing he could reach up and take them with his hands, and bring them down into his canoe and carry them off, so he could treasure them alone in the darkness of his reed house after dark. Once, on a whim, he paddled to the black wash under the mountains where the Abgalu would sometimes appear, and asked the waters, "Can a man own the mountain peaks?" And when he asked this, the black water began to boil, and the Abgalu arose from the waters underneath, like a face coming close through the far side of a plate of obsidian. The Abgalu was like a mighty sturgeon, and like a strong man. 18 feet long or more was its body, and the muscled legs of a man came from beneath its tail, and the muscled chest and arms of a man came from the fish's belly, and the fish's head was thrown back like a hood, and beneath it was the long bearded face of a man. The beard and eyes of the Abgalu were black as obsidian, and of obsidian were made the bracelets and anklets by the Abgalu worn. "No," spoke the Abgalu. Its voice was deep and clear. "A man may not own the mountain peaks. Here are listed the things that a man may own: himself and his canoe, his clothes and his paddle, his knife and his bowl. All other things belong to themselves, or to the people, or to the Igigi, or to the Anunnaki." Alulim was more than displeased to hear this wisdom. But what man can dispute with the Abgalu, who are children of water and knowledge? Sullenly, the young man turned his gaze aside. When he dared glance back, the Abgalu had descended back beneath the flood. Alulim steered away and paddled home. For 6 days he kept to himself. But on the 7th he returned to the mountains to watch the gold come out across their peaks. There was a kind of hunger in him. He didn't know for what. But when he watched the sunlight on those peaks, it was like when a starving man watches others eat. It made the hunger both better and worse. If he could just have those peaks, he thought, he could be whole. Now, it was the custom of the people, based on the sage advice from the Upgalu, that they not set foot on the great water's far bank, for that was where the Igigi lived, and the Igigi had agendas of their own. But in the months that followed, Alalim drifted closer and closer to the further shore, for in that direction lay the gold-peaked mountains. At last, he rested one evening holding onto the reeds of the far shore, watching moonrise cross the pale jasper of the eastern sky. The next evening, he tied off his canoe, filled his fingers with fistfuls of reed, and pulled himself up onto the forbidden bank. And there found a paradise of rich and gentle greenery, boughs bending with heavy fruit, and brightly colored birds flitting amongst the godlike girths of date palm trees. He walked for a short time, with the gold-limed peaks before him, and the foliage rustling at his fingertips. And then he found, as he bent to eat a golden date fallen amongst the grass, that he was not alone. In the purple of the evening, he had not seen the creature until its shadow fell across him. For a moment he was paralyzed with dread. But when horrid death did not come suddenly down upon him, he brought himself to slowly turn toward the danger. It was an Igigi that had come upon him. Silhouetted against the Alexandrite sky and first faint stars, the Igigi stood at 12 feet tall, at least, its body that of a strong man with a dark sheepskin. From its bare shoulders spread 4 vast purple wings, and the creature's head was like that of a bearded vulture, but enormous and purple dark, with eyes obsidian black. The Igigi bent before him, offering a taloned hand. Too terrified to refuse, Alalim allowed it to help him to his feet. The creature's touch was scaly and dry, gentle and supportive for all the size of its hand and sharpness of its claws. It stared down at him for a long, long moment, and Alalim found that his tongue had gone too dry for him to be able to beg for his life. At last, the creature threw out one hand to the side, gesturing toward the mountain peaks, which still shone rosy gold above the spreading twilight. When Alalim did not understand, the Igigi withdrew its arm and then flung the gesture out again. The golden mountain tops. With its other claw, it gestured toward Alalim, offering. And then it beckoned. But the young man had already begun to back away, heart pounding in his chest, unable to tear his gaze away from the creature's nightish eyes. The Igigi did not follow. It only waited where it stood, and beckoned, while the purple shadows rose on every side. Alalim turned and fled, half expecting to feel the talons in his back, as flowers and thorns brushed and scratched his face by turns, and he barreled through the gardens, bounding down the sloping hills toward the safety of the water, Enki's realm, and his canoe. He paddled home in haste. For 6 weeks he kept away from the farther shore. But at last, on the 7th, his longing for the mountain tops brought him drifting close again as the sun began to sink and the golden hour came. And now his hunger for their distant gold was even stronger than it had been before. It was like a thirst in his throat, a lust in his belly, to have, to eat, possess, surround, and penetrate that beauty. There were clouds as pink as rhododendrons in the sky, and the purple mountains stacked behind the red and gold. And high above, a distant vulture soaring downwards, slowly. Suddenly, Alalim's heart froze inside his chest, for as the vulture tumbled toward him, he realized it was larger than he'd thought. It had too many wings. It was the Igigi. He bent his sculls to the water in panic, but he was too slow, and the thing above too swift. In seconds he could feel the thunder of its wings, and then it swooped low overhead, plunging the world into purple dark beneath its pinions, and whirling in midair to alight at the prow of his canoe. So huge was the Igigi that the boat nearly sank below its weight, and Alalim felt himself and the stern lifted several inches above the water. But the Igigi seemed to mean no harm. It crouched, glassy black eyes fixed, its beak half open, almost aping a smile as it gestured toward him. Offering. Something glimmered in that scaly palm. 3 little stones that shone like mountaintops at sunset. And so tempting were they that Alalim almost reached out. "What are they?" he asked. The Igigi smiled, silent. "Offering. I can have them? Offering. Alalim reached out to accept, and the creature's talons clamped around his wrist. Before he could scream, the Igigi had leaped into the air, swamping the canoe as it caught the evening wind with wide, dark wings. Alalim howled and tried to wrench free, but the creature's grip was like stone. And now they were high enough to see the barb fish and bull sharks, and even the huge Ipgalu drifting like minnows underneath the wide, dark flood. Alalim had no choice but to hold on, for the Igigi bore him higher and higher, over the date palm groves, and then over hills of almond, oak and pear, and then until the air grew dry and thin and cold, and breath refused to catch in Alalim's lungs. One full circle brought them round the nearest mountain's golden hips, and then they plunged down into crevices filled with inky dark below the mountain's feet. Down, down, and further down, until all was dark around them, and it seemed that they had flown as far down as they had upward flown before. And there, the Igigi finally let him go. He dropped a few feet, to land painfully on the cold rock and dusty cavern floor. Above him, the dimming heavens were an amethyst strip against the darkness, far away. He was standing at the bottom of a pit cave so deep that he would never be able to climb out. The Igigi landed beside him, and its outline was a darkness against the surrounding darkness, so crisp that he was able to see when it beckoned him. There was a gap in the wall of the pit, and a cool breeze bubbled up from within. From the taste of this air, Alalim could tell that it came from deep under the earth, perhaps as far down as Kur, the underworld where the spined Galus dwelt in frenzy and hunger. From the Igigi's excited gesturing, he could tell it wanted him to follow it down there. He took a final look at the distant purple sliver of sky above. "I don't have much of a choice, do I?" he said. The Igigi silently laughed and shook its head. Then it raised the black outline of one talon to its beak in a shushing gesture. It turned and climbed through the crevice and was gone. Alalim did not wait to follow. It was pure dark on the other side, and he scrambled to catch up with the Igigi's stooped form. The creature was once again carrying those 3 small golden stones in the scaled palm of its hand, and those stones now gave rise to a light that framed the Igigi in the darkness, sending long purple shadows from its long purple feathers. These shadows fell across him, and they were so heavy and clear that he thought they almost stained his flesh. How long he followed, he would never be sure. It might have only been a few moments. It might have been whole turns of the world's cycle. Time was gone. It only returned with the distant sound of splashing water up ahead. Could it be a river? Could they have traveled so much, or so little, distance in that time? The darkness widened ahead of them, and the Igigi slowed, bending close to Alalim, so that he could see the dried blood on its massive beak. Once again, the creature raised one finger in a silencing gesture. Alalim nodded, and with a nod of its own, the Igigi led him through into a great cavern. It raised the golden stones, and around them the walls shone with flecks of reflected light, like golden sunset on the mountain peaks. So unexpected, so wondrous was the sight that Alalim almost cried out in joy and wonder. But then he realized they were not alone. For down by the cavern's farthest end, where water ran deep and black across the stone, a great figure lay stretched out in sleep, greater than the Igigi, as the Igigi was greater than Alalim. It was an Abgalu, and the curled beard and sleeping solemn face were the same as those of the Abgalu who had counseled him before, the Abgalu who had counseled his people for 8 times as long as 60 lifetimes of his forebears. He understood now why the Igigi had wanted silence. Letting the golden light dwindle to a reddish glow, the Igigi crouched beside a fallen stone and gestured for Alalim to collect it. Was there some power that stopped it from touching aught in the golden cave? Or was the creature simply too lazy to perform its own work? Whatever the answer, Alalim collected the stone and bore it with great effort from the cave. Once they were crouching together, far back in the outer darkness, the Igigi smiled and took the stone from his hands. No sooner had the creature touched it than some magic caused the stone to heat and smoke and crack, and the smoke that it gave off was noxious, acrid, and it made Alalim retch silently and collapse to the hard stone floor with a headache pounding in between his eyes. But the Igigi seemed unbothered by the smoke, or by the heat, or by the stone's searing, glowing blood that poured golden as sunset between one set of talons to pool in the Igigi's other palm. There the molten ore cooled, and by the time the smoke had cleared and Alalim's nausea had passed, the Igigi passed him another golden stone, just like the ones it had offered on the boat. It was still warm. The Igigi watched him accept it, tilting their head, as if to say, "Do you understand?" And after thinking about this for a moment, Alalim realized he did. "I can have these," he whispered. The Igigi nodded. "And I can have more of them. If I heat the rocks like that and make them bleed. It's not just something Igigi can do. I can do it if I build a fire hot enough." The Igigi nodded. It seemed to be smiling. But Alalim frowned, remembering how heavy the stone had been, how much heat it had taken to make it bleed, feeling the lingering headache from the smoke. It was too much work. He could never do it on his own, but there were no others on the water who hungered like he did for the mountain tops. "I'll need to get others to help," he said. The Igigi nodded. "Then I'll need to make them." And now the Igigi nodded vigorously, smiling, silently laughing. And then a darker thought occurred to Alalim. "The Abgalu will never allow it," he said. "The Abgalu tells us we cannot own things." But the Igigi only looked at him, with blank black eyes, smiling, waiting for Alalim to arrive at the thought's conclusion. Then the Abgalu must die. And no sooner had he said it than the Igigi flourished its feathered limbs and produced a blade, all made of that shining sunset stone, with a purple amethyst set into its hilt. Alalim's eyes went wide. He had never seen a thing like this before, and the delight he felt when its warm heft settled into his palms was akin to that of strong drink. But when he considered the enormity of what he was being asked to do, he hesitated. If the Abgalu dies, who will look after my people?" The Igigi smiled. "You will." It nodded once. It smiled. And so, thrumming with ecstasy and hope and fear, Alalim turned back toward the cave.
I was never really a runner. The way I see running is a gift. especially when you have stage 4 cancer. I'm Anne. I'm running the Boston Marathon, presented by Bank of America. I run for Dana-Farber Cancer Institute to give people like me a chance to thrive in life, even with cancer.
Join Bank of America in helping Anne's cause. Give if you can at BofA.com/supportAnne. What would you like the power to do? References to charitable organizations is not an endorsement by Bank of America Corporation. Copyright 2025.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
It had not been like any cave-in Ordo had ever seen. One moment the mine was steady. Men were filing in and out en masse, Ordo among them. They trudged through the tunnels and down the shafts, walking along the gold ore conveyors in their Kincaid coveralls, talking as they always did about what they'd do once their contracts were up. Then, the next moment, the ground beneath Ordo twitched violently, the twitch of a sleeper having a nightmare, and they were all thrown to the ground. And then, the loudest noise Ordo had ever heard, so loud that even the memory of it brought waves of nausea. The last thing Ordo remembered was his friend Almir reaching down for him, saying something he couldn't hear. Then the ceiling fell in and the world went dark. Ordo hefted the canteen that had fallen with him into his little pocket of safety. He drank a thimble of water and sloshed it between his teeth as best he could, deglazing the rock dust from his mouth. He hoped the canteen wasn't Almir's. Once again he attempted to stretch his cramping limbs. If only he had a bit more space. The rubble had fallen in just such a way that it formed a small sphere of safety around Ordo, only large enough for him to sit with his knees pulled up to his chest, like a fetus waiting to be born. He once again pressed his hands and feet against the cool rock around him, pushing his limbs as far as they would go, but stopped when he thought he felt something shift. There was no telling how much debris was piled above him. One wrong move, a single pebble out of place, and he could be crushed. All that he could do now was wait and breathe. But that was impossible. There was nothing to do but obsess and worry. He started doing the math. Kincaid's long tunnel mining operations were known for digging deeper shafts than any other in their endless search for gold. He'd taken an elevator down one of these vertical shafts this very morning, descending kilometer after kilometer, passing by layer after layer of ancient dirt and stone. One section was pockmarked with hundreds of fossilized creatures of all sizes, and Ordo felt like he was sinking through the remnants of the Great Flood itself. It was as if God had placed a barrier to say, "There's nothing down there for you. Turn back." But still, the shaft descended. How long would it take the rescue crews to find him? What if the elevator had collapsed? It could take days for them to reach him. He licked his parched lips. The water would have to be rationed. And, of course, the darker thought. The thought as dark as the pitch-black world around him. What if they thought he was already dead? No amount of rationing would save him if nobody was coming. He pushed the thought down. His hands roamed the tight space, seeking distraction. And sometimes the world provides. After a few moments, Ordo's fingers brushed by a fist-sized rock at his feet. Odd. He was sure it hadn't been there a few moments before. Ordo turned the rock over in his hands. At first blush it seemed ordinary, but it was heavy. Several pounds heavier than a rock that size should be. His fingers explored the surface, touching unusual edges, some of which were clearly random acts of geology, but in other spots these edges felt almost manufactured, as if forming an image in relief. If only he could see it. Ordo rapped the rock with his knuckles to see if it might be hollow, and yelped, instinctively shoving his grimy fingers in his mouth. The taste of blood and filth. Those strange edges were sharp. He dropped the rock back by his feet, and Ordo gingerly picked it up again. He brushed his fingers along the surface, and this couldn't be the same rock. The edges were all different now, weren't they? His blind hands slowly moved over the surface as he focused, trying to make a mental map of the object. But as his fingers twisted and turned, he only grew more confounded. Several times he was certain his thumbs were touching spots that were side by side, only for them to be on opposite ends of the rock. Ordo shook his head. Taking a deep breath, he blocked out the echoing silence inside his rocky tomb. Ordo held the rock between his knees, placed a single finger on one of the edges, and slowly began to trace it to its final destination. The edge ran off like a wild river, sometimes smooth, sometimes rugged, sometimes so sharp that Ordo nearly pulled his finger away. He pushed on, weaving back and forth, but never reaching the curve that would take his finger around to the other side. It should have arrived inches ago. Now feet. It wasn't that big. Ordo knew that. Moments earlier, he'd held it in his cupped hands. And yet, the edge continued on until Ordo was sure he'd been stretched to his limit, that at any moment his shoulder would creak, his tendons would snap, and his arm would pull itself free to continue tracing the edge forward into the empty, black horizon. It was crazy, but this rock, somehow, must have been bigger than the space he was trapped in. He laughed, and it was a high, shrill sound of madness that ricocheted in the tiny space like a bullet. And then, Ordo felt a breeze. The rock was immediately forgotten. Ordo twisted and contorted until his body turned the other way. There was no doubt. A light breeze came in through a small crack in the rocks, ebbing and flowing every few seconds. Away to the surface, away out. Ordo brought the rock down hard and felt the crack splinter. Again, and it began to widen. The breeze flowed in around him, bringing the slightly damp smell of moss with it. He hammered at it, wincing as the chamber shook with his efforts. Once it was large enough, Ordo slung the canteen over his shoulder and pushed his lower body through the crack. It was a tight fit, but soon enough he was through. On the other side, the crack opened up into a cramped tunnel. There was no choice but to follow it. Ordo gasped and grunted, squeezing his aching body through the narrow crevices as the tunnel led him up, down, left, and right. Crouching, crawling, climbing, his bloody fingers scrabbling blindly against the rocks in search of the next gap or foothold. He was certain he must be miles from where he started. Several times he found himself trapped between two cave walls, unable to move. Each time his panicked breathing expanded his chest until he felt certain the tunnel walls would crush him right then and there. And as his mind strangled itself, there would appear, unbidden, the worst images he'd ever imagined, rancid and vile, like they were stench blown in on the wind. Shrieking, twisted human forms dancing in his mind's eye, struggling to free themselves from these same dark cracks. Animals intentionally pinioned here, left alone in the black tunnels to bellow and screech until what? It was never clear. But the visions continued to haunt him, ebbing and flowing like the wind. When they became too much, when Ordo had convinced himself he could truly see the blood and flesh painting the black cavern walls around him, then he would reach for the strange rock. He would trace the edges methodically, and somehow the fear would drain from his bones. Then he would use the stone as a cudgel, chipping away at the cracks, widening them until he could move forward again, chasing the humid breeze. Hours passed, perhaps days. On some level, Ordo knew that his body had been pulverized by the journey. He'd abandoned his tattered clothing leagues ago, and now ribbons of skin were peeling from his arms and legs, shredded by unseen stalactites. Stars still twinkled in front of his eyes from when he'd slipped and bashed his head on a downslope. But it was all strangely painless. As long as one finger kept tracing the impossible rocks, impossible edges, he knew, somehow, that he would be able to continue. The dark, silent journey became almost meditative. Time disappeared. He existed only as a body, empty of everything except that breeze and a primeval desire for freedom. And yet, at the dim bottom of his mind, Ordo could not deny one simple fact. Despite the disorienting twists and turns, he knew that this tunnel led down, down, down into the earth. Each step took him away from the surface. But something else was also happening. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tunnel had begun to widen. A few more miles, and Ordo was able to stand instead of stoop, walk instead of wriggle. One hand ran along the wider tunnel wall, finding it smooth and soft, as if carved by human hands. The breeze intensified here, hotter, stronger. Each pulse of wind hit him like a wall of moisture. It felt wrong, like someone had kidnapped a monsoon and transported it here. All at once the terrible thoughts began again. The red-hot agony of a young, paralyzed man laying in the darkness, his exposed veins and arteries being meticulously braided by unseen hands. A shrieking, eyeless bull frothing at the mouth as strange forms forced it to walk the very tunnel Ordo now walked. Ordo squeezed his eyes shut, banishing the images with a different, more familiar kind of darkness. His fingers traced. He pressed onward until, after what seemed like miles, the smooth wall gave way to open air. The tunnel appeared to open up into a massive chamber. He couldn't see, but Ordo could feel the sudden freedom. Despite the lack of sunlight or an exit, he still held his arms wide and turned in circles, savoring it. His shoulders even unhunched themselves. Ordo lay down and stretched out in the darkness. He took a swig from the canteen and sloshed it around in his parched mouth. There wasn't much left, but Ordo knew something had shifted the moment he walked into the chamber. His journey was near its end. He shouted something wordless and heard the cavern answer back a dozen times before the next gust of wind shattered the echo. Ah, the breeze. It was close now. The chamber seemed to stretch out endlessly in all directions, but all Ordo had to do was follow the airflow to its source. Here and there he would walk directly into large stalagmites, thick as redwoods, that erupted high into the cavern above. There was no telling where they ended. Their surfaces somehow reminded him of the strange rock, and he found his fingers automatically tracing their gigantic edges. His walk continued until, slowly, Ordo realized he was on an incline. The ground led him upwards for a good mile or so, and, for a moment, he let himself entertain the idea that the surface lay just beyond. Then the ground began to shudder slightly, rocking him back and forth. Dislodged dust and grit sprinkled down from the ceiling. Another cave-in? No, it couldn't be. He'd come so far. Ordo froze, mentally willing the shudder to stop. Slowly, it subsided, and Ordo continued his pilgrimage. The breeze came harder now, swirling around his ankles like a riptide, nearly catching him off balance. He walked like a zombie, with his arms outstretched, just to absorb some of the impact. Finally, he reached the source. A vast vertical tunnel that sank deep into the earth. Ordo peered over the edge, almost believing for a moment that he could see light at the bottom. It was unimaginable. He didn't need to see it to feel its magnitude. Prostrate, he crawled around the lip of it, trying to guess its size. Bigger than the biggest Kincaid shaft. Bigger than anything. And as he reached the halfway point, he discovered three more gargantuan shafts, all belching up moist gale. Ordo stood between the four pits. He turned the strange rock in his hand. Once, twice, 3 times. And then the ground moved again. Ordo felt himself sliding towards the shaft. He dug in his heels, but the earth beneath him kept tilting until he was on his back. He could feel the tunnel mouth waiting to gobble him up. His one free hand scrabbled to find purchase, while the other refused to let go of the strange stone. His fingers found bizarre, soft crevices, malleable like animal tissue. And if the chamber had held still, maybe he would have managed to hold on. But it kept turning until Ordo's grip failed. He tumbled the rest of the way to the shaft, just barely managing to grab onto its fleshy lip with one hand, while the other still clutched the strange stone. His body dangled out into that deep, empty darkness, swinging wildly in the wind like a tattered flag. The wind billowed up beneath him. Gruesome scenes blew in like the grit of 10,000 desert storms. 2 legless rams with false golden wings stitched to their backs, driven so mad with fear that all they could do was bite and tear at their own mutilated bodies. A man willingly, gleefully throwing himself down the tunnel, leaping in ecstasy only to break his bones blindly against the stones below. Endless bodies crushed to a fine black pulp, left to sluice down through the tunnels, eventually pooling in this very chamber. And Orto realized it was all to feed this thing, this gaping tunnel, no, this gaping mouth that Orto now hung over. A being that had slept for millennia, that may never wake up at all, but who still needed to devour. A being so monumental that you could walk across it for miles without realizing it was even alive. A being with mine-shaft mouths and dreams so powerful they would bleed right through your mind to become your dreams. Or were they memories? The being shuddered in its sleep again, and this time Orto's grip failed. He fell, and, as he did, he screamed. From the bottom of the tunnel, a terrible light began to shine, so bright it blinded him. Orto felt tendrils grasping at his arms, his legs. He screamed wordlessly again, lashing out violently with a strange stone. "Hold him, boys! Hold him!" shouted a voice. "Good God! Someone, call the EMTs!" 400 men died down there that day. No bodies were ever recovered, not even a bloody scrap. They hadn't even gone looking for Ordo. They just happened to find him 2 weeks later during cleanup. A miracle, the newspapers called it. Kincaid placed him on paid leave for a few weeks, long enough so that the media could move on and wouldn't notice his firing, though Ordo didn't mind. He would never go back underground again. And yet, even decades later, his thoughts would return to that black place below the earth. Now a sick old man, Ordo sits in his armchair, inhaling dust and dander from a rug he's too stooped and broken to clean. He takes a pull from a half-empty oxygen tank by his side as he wonders, once again, was the cave-in an accident? Or were we fed to that thing? And as he thinks this, his gnarled fingers trace the edges of the strange stone for the millionth time. His talisman. In all the confusion, he'd managed to sneak it home. Kincaid never would have allowed him to keep it. After all, it was the biggest nugget of gold he'd ever seen. Hey, easy now. Easy. You have to last a lifetime, you know. Or at least until the end of your shift. Come on, sit down for a minute. Don't worry, we'll make our quota for the day. The supervisors at this site won't bother you as long as you make your quota. I would know, I've been here my whole life. But you're new here, huh? Came in with the recent transfers? Yeah, I thought so. They're always shaking things up, you know, evening out efficiency across the planet, where moving workers where the resources are. I'm not sure what difference it makes, personally. It's all just mining now. No more forests to clear, no agriculture aside from the algal farms. They took all the manufacturing off-world. But then again, what do I know? What did you hit here? I'm curious. Looks like you struck a fresh vein. Gold, huh? That's alright, I guess. Iron or zinc would have been better. Copper would be best. More metal for your effort. For the quotas, you know? Anyway, you said you transferred from the southern continent, right? Rough place, I've heard the stories. So maybe a little change-up from time to time is for the best, huh? I can tell you one thing for sure, though. The view is probably a lot better out here. I assume you've seen it, hanging up there in the sky? Though actually, with the way you've been picking away, I'm not sure if you have taken your eyes off the ground to take a peek. But anyway, there it is now. Source of all our woes. Unassuming, don't you think? Not much to it at all. Just a box, really. Thing is, how big do you figure the thing is? With us being able to see it with the naked eye while it's up there in orbit. Pretty damn big, I figure. Do you know how it got there? That's a serious question because I don't know. Not for sure, anyway. Just the stories my gran used to tell me. She was a tough old broad. She lived a long time, long enough that she was a young girl when that first showed up. And the way she tells it, it did just show up. Popped into existence one sunny day, snap of the finger. Except it was certainly night somewhere on the planet, and almost certainly raining somewhere else. So just double-checking, you haven't heard a different version of that part? Well, then I'll continue with mine. The way she told it is that one day that box simply appeared up there. And obviously the people of the world wanted to know what it was, where it came from. At first. Because once they discovered what was in it, nobody seemed to care much for the where or why or how. Now you and I can't see what's inside, of course. What was inside is long gone. But my gran did her best to describe it, and I think I've got a pretty good picture in my head. See, it was kind of cracked open, that box, just a little bit. Maybe got bumped around on whatever journey took it here. But the stuff inside was starting to slowly drip, or ooze or drain, out of it. Enough that eventually you could see it as well from the surface. And enough that it lightly rained down over a few places. This clear, almost white liquid that shimmered. Not as thin as water, not as thick as oil. Slick to the touch, and just a bit warm, always. No matter the weather, the temperature of its surroundings, it never lost that warmth. Its dew never changed to frost. And it had the faintest smell of honey. Though I'm not actually sure what honey smells like. Sweet, I suppose. Well, obviously, this mystery liquid raining down from the sky intrigued the world, and the scientists got to work on finding out what it was. Though, again, what it was became less important once they found out what it did. I don't really understand it all. To be honest, I don't understand any of it. But they figured out that it was, or at least one of its purposes was, as a fuel source. A nearly perfect fuel source. More efficient than anything we had at the time. A drop on your finger could keep the lights in your hab room on for 10 years. And it was clean. No smoke, no byproduct, no nothing. Once used, it just sort of leached away from our reality into the ether, without a chemical trace. A miracle, they called it. Manna from heaven. And what did we do? Well, we killed each other for it, of course. No, I don't understand either. You know, and let me just see if the soups are around. Okay. You know, I used to think we were all in this together. I felt as bad for them as I did for us. All of us trapped in this hell. And when you really look at us in this pit mine a kilometer below sea level, I do almost literally mean hell. But one year, a few years ago, we were under our monthly quota for this site. Second month in a row. So the supervisors here, they decided to set an example. Except they also decided to turn that example into a sick little game. We're organized into work teams of 50, right? You show up with your team at the start of the shift and everybody grabs their pick. 50 workers, 50 picks set out. Well, one day, early morning, first shift of the new day, they only set out 49 picks. We didn't notice, of course. People just filed in and grabbed their pick. Nobody was counting them. But then, of course, the last person walks up and there's nothing left. I didn't know him too well, but I remember him. Older guy, maybe 45 or 50. Never talked to him much, but he was nice enough. pleasant to work with. Bad left knee from an injury. Well, he shuffles up to grab a pick, sees there's nothing for him, and he hardly has time to look over at the rest of us with empty hands and this confused expression before we hear a crack from above and a little ways off, and his head just pops into a fine red mist, and his body plops down, and those of us who aren't screaming look over to see one of the guards on the tier above us aiming, their weapon still steaming. And then we hear another crack in the distance, just a little ways north where the next camp over is. Another to the east. And another. And that kept happening all day, as the new shifts kept rolling in. And the message didn't need to be translated for us. Laggards were not to be suffered under any circumstance. And wouldn't you know it, efficiency shot right back up to where it needed to be. And I realized then that, no, we are not in this together. Not even here at the bottom of the heap. No need to worry, though, about us sitting here. We do our best to stay on top of things, for everyone's sake. And there haven't been theatrics like that in a good while. Though maybe you're not worried at all. And maybe if the rumors I hear about other sectors, other continents, are true, I'm even more naive than I think. And maybe the view out here, seeing that thing up there, isn't so great after all. Yes, the wars fought over it, and that miracle fuel dripping out of it, were atrocious. Technology advanced at a rapid pace, and needless to say, the priority for that advancement was military application. Infantry held weapons that could melt the thickest vehicle armor, vehicles and aircraft that were too fast, too silent, and deadly from too far away to be shot at by them. Cities burned, oceans boiled. Civilian casualty wasn't seen so much as a tragedy then as an unfortunate reality. Having your border fringe home reduced to a crater, being lucky if you even left a charred corpse in this earth and not just ash. Well, that was a price to pay for controlling the Manna. The world was on the brink. And then, it wasn't. Peace, just like that. Out of nowhere, really. Yeah, my gran never did explain that part very well. Though, to be fair, she was still just young when all this happened, and it was a chaotic time. But the fighting was over, and what followed was an age of prosperity. With the fuel, the Manna now free for other use, normal people could finally reap the benefits of that advanced technology. Medicine, agriculture, and hydroponics. Machines to eliminate the need for labor. Work replaced by vocation. Can you imagine that? Your forebears and mine, living in paradise. Not sick or hungry or sore all the time. One word and a Tensis drone would fly halfway around the world to bring you whatever you needed. I mean, you've heard all this. From your grandparents too, right? From someone, though, yeah? I mean, you must have some story of someone down the line living well in those golden years. Well, obviously, that didn't last. Obviously, that big box in the sky, filled to bursting with liquid miracle, didn't just come from nowhere. Someone built it and filled it, and they didn't just leave it floating up there out of some kind of generosity. No, they probably lost it. And eventually, they found it. It's not even clear who they are, whether they're one race or society, or a vast empire, only that they're organized, and that they are tremendously exacting when it comes to the value of what's theirs. And as it turned out, we had used quite a bit of what was theirs, and maybe it didn't seem like much at the time, but when it came time to pay, the bill was staggering. And there was nothing to be done about it. It was quite clear that these were people far beyond us in every way that it could count. There would be no burning cities. If they saw fit, this entire planet would be reduced to cosmic dust. and there was no higher power to appeal to. Or, even if there was, they surely didn't care. We had to pay. But with what? Our currency was useless, our knowledge the stuff of children, our technology even at the peak of human achievement not fit to be baubles. No, our debt was to be paid in a far more base coin. Raw resource, service, and humiliation. Indefinitely. Overnight, the planet became one great work prison. Our machines were taken from us to be melted down for their metal, maybe because they could use it to make better machines, maybe to keep us in our place, or just because it's more satisfying to them that we do the work with our hands. All because we cracked open a shipping crate that fell off a proverbial interstellar truck. Probably one out of untold thousands. A rounding error. And I don't see any good ending to it all. If it was even possible to pay back what we owe, we probably would have done it by now. My guess is that in a few more decades we'll have picked the Earth clean of anything worth shipping off. And then, well, maybe they'll make it quick. Or maybe they'll just leave us here. All the iron gone, no magnetic field, the solar winds blowing through and drying up anything left. It all makes me think about a lot of things and a few ifs. Like how if we hadn't spent years massacring each other, maybe we could have advanced even further in that time than we did. Had a fighting chance when they arrived. Not likely, but it's nice to think about. No, more realistically, I question those few years of peace and prosperity that we did have. Your family, your people, don't seem to have any recollection of it. So, was it really peace? Or did somebody just win? I don't know if my gran was ashamed, or if she was just blissfully unaware of what was happening elsewhere. I mean, it's obvious, really. There are haves and have-nots now, and there were before that time. Why would it be any different then? And, you know, the quarry supervisors, the guards, the sector and quadrant chiefs. They got picked somehow. Or their forebears were picked somehow. Nothing really changes, does it? No matter how much we have, or how little. The best thing they could do would be to just leave us here, to rot. Fly off and leave us to our ruin. And when we do die and ooze into the dry, empty soil, maybe, just maybe, something new will sprout. Something better. Or maybe we'll just be forgotten. Our world forgotten. A huge piece of garbage floating in its orbit. Empty, left behind. As a testament to our failings. Or just as a cruel joke. Sorry, I don't think I've ever talked that much in my life. Well, back to work. Nothing else to do. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Patrons can listen to The Wrong Station ad-free, as well as get access to bonus episodes, discussions, and more. This week's episode, Gold, was written by Alexander Saxton, Jacob Duarte Spiel, and Anthony Botelho. Thank you to Matthew Rhodes, Jin Urso, and AK for helping us keep the lights, well, off. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, or wherever it is you listen to The Wrong Station. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botelho, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed on the piano by Ilan Citrin, and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmid. You can follow The Wrong Station on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.